Only mode.
Hi everyone, good afternoon on this beautiful sunny day. I'm Susan Kaufman. I'm here for Attitude Magazine's ADHD Expert Series. Thank you so much for joining us today. I don't need to remind any of you that living with attention deficit disorder is stressful, especially because our minds can be so unsettled that it makes changing behaviors or checking things off our to-do list really difficult. So we're very pleased today to welcome Mark Bertin, MD, to discuss mindfulness for adults living with ADHD, a beginner's guide. Dr. Bertin's going to explain mindfulness, what it is, how it can improve mental clarity for adults, for parents, and for teachers. And he'll give us some simple strategies for beginning to practice mindful awareness in daily life. I think the important thing about mindfulness, as he will explain, is that it is a technique for helping you change behaviors and develop new practices so we can all live with ADHD much more effectively. And in that, he will talk about healthy sleep and diet habits, as well as respond to your questions about specific challenges that you have and how mindfulness might help you address them. Dr. Bertin's a board-certified developmental pediatrician. He practices medicine in Pleasantville, New York, where he works with families, and that would include parents, children, and adults with ADHD. He's the author of the Family ADHD Solution, a book that integrates mindfulness with evidence-based ADHD care. And we were just very excited to learn from him that he has a new book coming out in September called Mindful Parenting for ADHD. It's a workbook, so very specific practical help. This book is already receiving glowing endorsements from, among others, Russell Barkley and luminaries in the ADHD field. Dr. Bertin has a terrific website, www.developmentaldoctor.com, where you can find much more information about his practice. And I think of most interest to many of you, an 8-week online course that's coming out beginning on May 5th called Mindful ADHD, Cultivating Calmness, Compassion, and Clarity. This is a great resource for anyone who wants to learn how to integrate mindfulness into their life with ADHD. We'll talk about the course a little more later. Before he begins talking, let me just describe for any of you who have not taken one of our, been on one of our ADHD experts webinars before, how it works. Welcome, and please post your questions for Dr. Bertin in the box on your screen. Dr. Bertin will go through his slides, and then he'll respond to as many questions as time permits. You are muted. If you have any comments to share with other webinar participants or questions, just go ahead and post those as well, and we'll share those. Any problems hearing us, please dial in via your phone line. This is an internet-based webinar, and if there are audio problems, it's because of your internet service. There's not much we can do about it. After the sessions, you'll find the webinar on demand, Dr. Bertin's slides, the audio on the Attitude website, attitudemag.com/webinars. So you literally, if you miss it or you have to leave or you want to take part in the webinar again, you can come back and you'll find it there to go through. With that, let me turn it over to Dr. Bertin, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much, Susan. I appreciate the invitation to be back. And as Susan talked about, my goal today is really to talk about how to get started with a mindfulness practice. I'm going to touch on a little bit of what mindfulness is, and as we see on the next slide. But really, recently I gave a talk with Attitude in which we talked a lot about why mindfulness might be useful and what mindfulness is. But for today's talk, what I want to emphasize is really how to get started in everyday practice. So I've actually lost my slides just now, so I'm just going to jump right in and get started. So the most important thing, I think, in terms of understanding what mindfulness is and how to get and what to do with it is, of course, just starting with a definition of mindfulness. So mindfulness means living in real time. Actually, there we go. Now I have my slides. I apologize, everyone. So the general definition of mindfulness means living life in real time as it is with certain emotional traits that we want to develop. And I'm going to talk about why that matters in just a moment. But the most important concept, especially for a lot of people living with ADHD, is that mindfulness is sometimes equated with a meditation practice, but it's not really a meditation practice. Mindfulness is a way of recognizing that we tend to live life in a particular way, which is often distracted and not paying attention to the choices we're making moment to moment, not paying attention to what we're saying or doing moment to moment fully. And if we can cultivate traits that build our ability to be more aware, to be more responsive and less reactive, and these other traits of just working with things we can change more skillfully and working with the things we can't more skillfully as well, that way of living, that way of approaching life will change our experience. It certainly will change our experience of ADHD. Next slide, please. So really the core concept with mindfulness, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, whether or not you have ADHD or you don't have ADHD, is we spend an awful lot of our time in life distracted and not paying attention to our actual experience, meaning we're doing one thing but we're thinking about the next. You've signed up for this webinar hoping to get something out of it, and almost immediately as I start talking, your mind may be listening almost fully to me or partly split or going somewhere else, or you attend for a little while then drift. Or when you're talking to your children, you may be paying attention to your children partially but also thinking about work, or you may be at work worrying about something at home. And really the core concept of mindfulness isn't that we're going to create some artificial stillness in our life or that we're going to reach some sense of nirvana or perfection. It's simply that we can practice otherwise. We can practice getting out of autopilot and giving more attention to what we're doing moment to moment in life. So next slide, please. And what we find as a core concept, and what we find in even thinking about how mindfulness can influence outcomes in ADHD, is that with that level of awareness, we develop more choice and flexibility in our life. And as long as we're on automatic pilot, as long as we're doing one thing, thinking about something else, as long as we're distracted, we tend to be falling back on learned routines, unconscious habits, thinking less flexibly. So at its core, the practice of mindfulness allows us simply to be more aware and to make more conscious choices in life. Next slide, please. Another core concept about looking at how mindfulness and ADHD work together has to do with stress. First of all, stress is inevitable for all of us in life. So there's no presumption that practicing mindfulness will eliminate all of your stress or again, find us this perfect place without any upset at all. But ADHD is more than a disorder of attention. It affects self-management overall. And if you're an individual who has it, that's going to increase your stress moment to moment. Research also says that if you're a parent of a child who has it, you're likely to feel more stressed and more anxious. There's risk for depression and marital strife and all sorts of findings that affect families as a whole. And stress itself will impact ADHD care because while a small amount of stress can be something that motivates us in a way, under chronic stress or excess stress, we have many, many effects on ourselves that generally aren't beneficial. So it has physical effects on our health. It affects our psychological well-being. And in terms of our moment-to-moment ADHD management, it undermines the resilience we need to sustain plans around ADHD. It forces us back onto old habits when we're stressed because we tend to be more reactive. It changes how we communicate and behave. So stress management around ADHD is a vital tool that can then help us stick to the plans that we have, the more concrete plans for ADHD that we're developing on our own or with or with somebody who's supporting us, a coach or a therapist or anybody else. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, that's my kind of quick overview of mindfulness, and it's kind of a look at the fact that mindfulness can help not really just with focused attention or as a meditation practice, but as this bigger skill set that helps us with managing stress and reactivity and changing habits. And I think I'm going to come back to that towards the end and into the question and answer session. But the primary goal for today is to really talk in follow-up to my last attitude discussion with how can you actually get started with a mindfulness practice? What's realistic when life feels so busy, when we're parents, when we're individuals living with ADHD. And what I want to touch on today are 3 different ways we can start building these traits that have to do with mindfulness in our everyday life. One are more formal practices, which are like the meditation practices for mindfulness, which is kind of like hitting the gym. It's a routine we can develop so that traits having to do with stress management and responsiveness begin to trickle over into everyday life. A second thing I want to look at are the more informal practices, which is how can we bring mindfulness into things we're doing anyway every day. It doesn't have to be like hitting the gym only to get in shape. It can be like going up the stairs, as I said. And then formal practices, or as I say in this slide, And formal practices in everyday life is kind of a mix of both. There actually are meditation practices that you can actually just fit into the things you're doing routinely in ways that make them much more easier to happen. So next slide, please. So first I want to start with what a formal mindfulness practice is. It's a question that comes up again with or without ADHD, but is often a big concern for parents or for adults who have ADHD, because the stereotype often is that a formal mindfulness practice, a meditation practice, requires sitting really still, or the goal is to have a really quiet mind even though your mind just doesn't want to sit still. And the reality is, for this type of meditation practice, there's an assumption our mind is going to be busy. We're never going to completely still the mind, even though that might sound somewhat disappointing. But the goal is to work towards more stillness, perhaps, and to work towards less distraction, but with the assumption that it's going to keep happening. The nature of things are that our minds tend to be busy, and that we really would like to be more focused or to not be as caught up in something that's stressing us out, and then we focus our attention somewhere else. And then, at some point it becomes distracted again, and how can we kind of gently just come back until it becomes more habitual to catch ourselves caught up in distraction and return. And even more importantly, it's important to recognize that mindfulness practice doesn't mean relaxation, and you're not going to be all blissed out or anything else at all. It's just a setting where you can practice more attention and more responsiveness with the hope that it's going to spill over into everyday life. Next slide, please. Another way I sometimes say that is, if we're going to work on stress management techniques in the first place, you probably don't want to work on them right in the most stressful moment of your life. That's kind of like if you decide you're going to go into moving pianos for a living, you probably don't want to go from no physical working out to moving, trying to participate in moving a piano without something bridging that gap. You're going to go weight lift and try to bulk up if you want to do that kind of heavy lifting. And stress management is just the same. We practice mindfulness every day so that those skills begin to trickle over into everything else we're doing. Particularly for a group that has that has ADHD, the question of whether we even need to sit still often comes up, and that's an important concept too. You don't have to sit still to practice mindfulness. For all the different formal mindfulness practices, all we're doing is choosing something that's very concrete to focus on, and then bringing ourselves back there each time we get distracted and drawn away somewhere else. So frequently we use breathing meditation as a starting point, not because there's anything magical about the breath. It's not even specifically a relaxation technique. We're not trying to do anything with how we're breathing in particular. It's just a recognition that if we're practicing mindfulness, we're almost certainly breathing. So there's a physical sensation there we can pay attention to that brings you back from the fact that your mind's been caught up ruminating something that happened 3 days ago, or you're feeling pulled 4 or 5 different ways in life. And then right now you're breathing, so you bring yourself back to that. And you can do that sitting in your chair, lying down, and if you're restless, standing up. Formal mindfulness practice can also be of body sensations, so you can focus on just your feeling of your feet on the floor as a way of focusing yourself out of a really tense moment or something that's got you caught up in feeling reactive. And then if sitting still is a real challenge, you can practice mindfulness as a formal walking practice. You can practice mindful yoga. Yoga is traditionally a mindfulness practice. Or again, in sort of tying together how can you make this happen in a busy life, you can practice mindfulness in eating, which doesn't mean eating slowly. It doesn't mean eating in a particularly unusual way. It's just a recognition that for most of us, most of the time when we're eating, we're barely paying attention to what we're doing. We're not really tasting the food. In fact, often the foods we like most are the ones we eat quickest without the most awareness. And when things are distasteful is when we bring our attention to them more fully, which certainly has parallels in everyday life. But the theme for all these different practices is simply by choosing to schedule your time, and I'm going to talk about scheduling towards the end of this because I know that's frequently a challenge, you begin to just practice the ability to notice that attention drifting and coming back. Notice when you're feeling reactive because you're feeling restless or bored, and coming back again. Oh, next slide, please. But I think one of the core things to recognize about mindfulness practice is it's also, is that it's an experience that is based on actually doing it. So I can describe it all I want, but in the end, the practice itself comes down to doing it and knowing what it is. So What I'd like to do now is just spend a few minutes, not a very long practice. Now I want to spend more time talking about how to do this today on a very brief guided practice, which for some of you may be a first practice, so I encourage you to just join in and follow along as best as you're able. And for some of you might be a long-standing practice, and I would encourage you to do exactly the same, because your experience will probably be similar. So for all of you paying attention right now, what I'd like you to do is to find yourself a comfortable position that you can sit in just for a minute or two, and put down anything that's in your hands, and shut off anything that you might find distracting near you or in the environment. And if you're comfortable with it, let your eyes close. And if that's uncomfortable, then let your gaze drop so that you're not looking at anything overly distracting or likely to draw your attention. And just notice for a moment that there is a physical sensation to breathing. So as you're sitting here, you might feel your belly or your chest rising and then falling again. Or you might notice the air moving in and out of your nose and mouth. And without needing to do anything about that, just bring your attention to that physical movement. And recognize that you're probably immediately distracted. Your mind goes off somewhere else. And that's fine. That's expected. Each time you find your mind somewhere else, just come back once again to the next breath. Breathing in, and then breathing out. Not aiming to force yourself into anything in particular, into feeling any particular way. Just focusing on that sensation of breathing. If you find yourself almost constantly distracted and come back to only one breath, that's perfect. And then when you're ready, opening your eyes. So we can touch base in the question and answer session more on that experience, but for any of you who have never tried mindfulness practice before, that's basically a starting practice. That's all there is to it. It's simple to describe. It's obviously infinitely challenging to do, but through that practice we can develop certain skills in life. So why don't we move on to the next slide. When people talk about mindfulness and ADHD, one of the first things that often comes to mind is that mindfulness does build focused attention. And there's been practices done both with adults with ADHD and in the general population showing that we do have the ability to increase our focus. No one's done a study yet saying we can treat our ADHD with mindfulness alone, but it can help. The bigger concept, though, I think that has to do with mindfulness is just recognizing that a lot of what we think is fixed in life, a lot of what we think we can't change about ourselves or situations seems permanent but isn't. And the allusion here to Target Store's nose is an allusion to an article in the New York Times several years ago in which they profiled the type of targeted advertising that Target Stores does, looking through shopping patterns to try to sort out who is probably pregnant among the women shopping at their store, and then trying to grab their shopping habits immediately, because what Target has shown is that habits don't change typically around shopping, and that's true for many aspects of life. So if they could grab your shopping habits around diapers, you're probably just going to keep shopping there. But the most interesting thing in the article, I think, that has to do with mindfulness and ADHD care is that their neuroscientists said that the moment you told somebody that this is just a habit was their opportunity to change. So the moment you pointed out, like, well, you don't have to shop there, you could shop somewhere else, that was the moment where people paused long enough to reflect and say, oh, wait, you're right. Maybe I can do something different. So when we talk about practicing mindfulness, it's as much about attention as about shifting our perspective and looking at ADHD differently. You know, what's the difference between the statement, I should be able to keep up with my bills, and a reflection on how executive function and ADHD get in the way of bill playing without that judgment? Or what's the change in relationship when we can work with a student with ADHD and switch from a perspective of he should be able to keep up with his homework to he has difficulty with ADHD and executive function, so how can we offer him skills to help with his homework? So the bigger picture of mindfulness has to do with trying to cultivate these types of habits. Next slide, please. And we can try to bring that perspective informally into everyday life too. So separate from or in addition to that formal practice I introduced, we can try to set reminders for ourselves to try to bring attention and responsiveness and awareness to our everyday life, and also begin to notice where we're bringing self-judgment to the situation and making things harder too. So not only are we trying to pay attention and struggling with that, but we're shooting ourselves. We're sitting there going, well, I should be better at this, and I should be paying more attention to my kids, but I keep getting distracted, and really just recognizing that the distractions will happen, and all we can do is just keep on working at it. Next slide, please. So informal mindfulness practice is just a way of bringing attention to our real life activities, not a setting expectation of perfection, only of ongoing change. And as I was talking with Susan as we went into this session today, this is the sort of thing that really begins to support everyday management of ADHD, so that one of the simplest examples is how most behavioral programs around ADHD ask us to focus on success and praise activities that go well. But for most of us, once things go off the rail, we get very caught up in our heads. So you're trying to get out the door in the morning and your children are totally off task. And then we're caught up in our own mind of how am I ever going to make the bus? This isn't going to happen. I'm going to be this. I'm going to be that. And when we can practice mindfulness sometimes, we can just remind ourselves to come back, to recognize that things are going well in some small aspect of the morning, and we can still praise that, where if we just remain caught up in the worry and the rush and everything else, we miss those limited but consistent opportunities to praise. So I think we need to take the slide to couple the other direction. Next one. So we can bring an informal mindfulness practice to just about anything we do, meaning we can remind ourselves that we're not paying attention to playing catch or to dinner or to the morning routine. Notice when we're caught up in problem solving and rumination or whatever else, and then just come back to whatever we're doing. So next slide, please. So there's a commonly raised question or commonly raised statement of when you're washing the dishes, just wash the dishes. And when I often add to that is when you're playing catch, just play catch. Just give your full attention to that experience, notice the thousands of distractions, and come back, and you're practicing mindfulness. And that can be a little mental break because stress tends to perpetuate itself. We have upsetting thoughts, so they lead to more upsetting thoughts, which lead to emotions, which lead to all this escalation. And if we can just give ourselves a break, not trying to force ourselves to feel relaxed, but just to attend to something else but that mental chaos, it often allows our minds to settle. So next slide, please. And we can bring that awareness to even aspects of ADHD, noticing when we're distracted in a conversation and maybe redirecting our attention, or really through awareness being able to tell someone that, you know, this moment is too distracting for me to have this conversation is a practice of mindful communication. Noticing anytime we're acting out of habit and labeling it a habit allows us to potentially do something different. There's certainly things about ourselves that we're very fixed, ingrained genetically. They are who we are, and we shouldn't judge ourselves for those things either. But there's so much of life that's habit that we can work with. You might notice when you begin to feel emotionally hooked by something, emotionally reactive, and just practice pausing, and that's an informal mindfulness practice. Or just practice around ADHD or anything else, asking yourself the mental question of, is it true? You know, he should be able to do his homework better. Is that true, or does he need different homework supports? Next line. And then lastly, before I move into the Q&A, because I know that's the emphasis for today, I just want to touch on the fact that many of the formal practices that we talk about can actually be fit into an everyday life. You know, they're not meant to be a major difficulty that we're adding to our lives. They're just meant to be a way to work on the fact that we'd like to build these skills. So before I go into that, I would like to say just initially, just notice assumptions you make about your schedule. So often when you talk about mindfulness practice, people make an immediate assumption that this isn't for me, I can't do this. And notice that that's a habit. That's an assumption too. So before you put it aside, I would encourage you all to try it out, to try to schedule it, to problem solve it and make it happen. And next slide, please. And yet, a lot of it has just to do with how we're going to manage stress moment to moment and how we're going to fit mindfulness practice into everything we're doing day to day. So let me just end by touching on a few common ways to do that. Certainly the intention with a lot of these mindfulness practices, as I alluded to on that last slide, was to just break that constant escalation that tends to happen around stress. The day just feels like we're shaking a snow globe over and over and over again, and we never have a chance to settle. So one practice I often encourage is just called the 15 breath practice, which these things are always easy to remember if you tie them to something you're doing. So at some type of transition, before meals, before coming home, at the top of the hour, just whenever you notice you're rattled, you can do a short mindfulness practice like I introduced before of just taking 15 breaths, noticing wherever your mind is, and just coming back to just that sensation of breathing, and then in pausing, pick how to proceed or pick how to move on to the next action. And the person who when I first read this concept, this article, suggested that if you can just do this once an hour, then you've done a mindfulness practice for 10 minutes a day, which is a perfect way to begin. And really 15 breaths takes less than a minute. So anytime you'd like to just begin with a mindfulness practice or feel off, a 15 breaths practice is certainly one way to fit it into daily life. Next slide, please. But you can also bring mindfulness practices into the basics of just everyday life, the things we're doing already, and use it even as an informal practice, and use it in ways that supports ADHD care, because each of these things I'm introducing here, mindfulness in eating, mindfulness in sleeping, mindfulness in exercise, are things that are often undermined by ADHD. There's almost a paradox of how better eating, sleeping, and exercise tends to help with ADHD, and yet all three of those types of routines are very hard to integrate into ADHD care or to get started with when you have it. So I mentioned mindfulness in eating, which can be taking any meal, any snack during the day, and just paying attention to the five senses, and then noticing when your mind's off somewhere and coming back. You can bring mindfulness into your bedtime routine. It's a great way for many people to wind down at night. Sometimes you can fall asleep during the mindfulness practice, which might not be the intention you bring to a mindfulness practice during the day, which is often about alertness and awareness. But if it helps you get your mind settled and fall asleep, that's great. Mindfulness in walking can just be, when you're going from one office to the next, when you're going down the corridor to school, when you're going from any point A to point B, you can do that walk caught up in your mind, caught up in rumination, totally off somewhere else, or you can just bring your attention back over and over again to what it feels like to be walking, what your feet feel like on the floor. Again, not in an unforced way, but maybe in the way you would otherwise bring only to a long hike somewhere else, where you just remind yourself that this is a stunning place in the mountains. Except we can bring that type of attention to a walk in the city, a walk in a school, or anywhere else. Next slide, please. A last informal practice we can do, and I know the handouts will be available for download, so I'm going to go through these things relatively quickly, is the stop practice, which is just that recognition that any moment we catch ourselves distracted in life, we can help ourselves come back to awareness by stopping and pausing, taking a breath or two, observing what's going on in our experience right now. What is it I'm feeling and thinking right now? And then picking what to do next as a way of creating responsiveness and awareness just moment to moment. And if we have time in the Q&A, I can come back to how this one practice in and of itself can be so supportive in managing ADHD, where so many tasks end without quite reaching the conclusion, that this practice in and of itself can help with ADHD management for that reason alone. Next slide, please. So the last thing I wanted to mention in introducing mindfulness in ADHD is just a recognition that ADHD itself makes new habits harder to form. So for anyone trying to form a new habit in life, the same basics hold true. And for ADHD, it's important to recognize that challenge and then stick to it. So if you'd like to build a mindfulness practice, what we typically talk about is set a manageable intention for your first step. It's often easier to tie it to what you do already. And then try to create the structure that's going to help yourself remember. So set up alarms, partner with somebody, be patient with yourself that this is a new habit you're trying to create. But most importantly, even as you're listening now, if that voice of doubt is already chiming in, all sounds really, really good, but never, never for me, recognize that that's a habitual voice. That is typically not the voice that actually logically examines things and problem solves. It's a habit that most of us have in life. And recognize that that doubt itself might undermine your plan, and then recognizing that as your habit, more fully commit to just trying something new. Next slide, please. So in creating that structure, go out and sign up for a class. And like Susan mentioned, I would hope to see many of you starting the class next week, which would be, but there are many, many others, and they're local ones and ones you can take in person as well. There are many apps you can use on your phone that will help you maintain the structure for a short practice every day. Buy a book or partner with someone, but create the structure that would allow you to develop this mindfulness practice for yourself. Next slide, please. So in just concluding, I just want to wrap it up by just saying that mindfulness is a practice that's meant to be accessible and practical, and something we can translate and make our own in different ways so that it works for us. It's not something that's really meant to just be read about or just listened to. It's something that you really need to just get out and do. Anybody can do it. It's accessible with or without ADHD. So create your plan and just set to it. And I think over time, hopefully, you will see all these changes develop in your everyday life, both in your broader life and specifically in ways that will help you manage ADHD. So I appreciate all your attention and look forward to seeing the type of questions that come up in the Q&A so we can follow up on some more of the details. So thank you all again for showing up today.
Thank you, Dr. Bertin. That was a great introduction. A couple of people asked me to repeat the information about your class, so let me do that now. On Dr. Bertin's website, www.developmentaldoctor.com, you'll find information about his online 8-week course that begins on May 5th called Mindful ADHD, Cultivating Calmness, Compassion, and Clarity. Hope many of you will log on and check out this course, which is very useful because you can replay it at any time. So although the classes are set for Tuesday, I think he said Tuesday evenings, they're available for replay on demand.
The other thing, Susan, I'd add to that is the class also is going to be integrating mindfulness into information about ADHD as well. So
Okay,
it's not only a mindfulness class, it's meant to really show how it can support ADHD care too.
Great. We have lots of wonderful questions, so please repeat. Someone has to come back to the link to the class. Okay. Well, we'll post it, as someone suggested, developmentaldoctor.com, Dr. Bertin's website, so you can find the class. Lots and lots of questions about integrating mindfulness into the daily challenges of ADHD, but before we go to those, can maybe just talk a bit more about what your experience has been with people learning mindfulness. I'm curious to know, how long does it take people? How do they tend to work best? What in your experience, how does someone succeed at integrating mindfulness into their life, which seems like a challenge for many people?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think there's a couple of things I would say to that. The first thing is certainly in leading the class, which I've been doing for a while now. It's often amazing to see that changes happen over just a few weeks. Not like all of life changes. It's not snake oil that suddenly everything goes away. But as people begin to practice mindfulness in a more direct way, they find themselves able to be a little less responsive instead of reactive when life gets challenging, or they're able to approach a situation like wrestling over a messy bedroom and kind of let go of how they have been doing it and approach it in a new way. So I think on a good analogy we often use, it's a little bit like physical exercise, so that you're going to notice some difference and some benefit immediately, and then the more you work with it, the more you're going to see that change expand. So that so I do think that you don't want to set up an expectation that that's impossible to match in jumping in, and yet of course if you're going to put the time into practicing something like mindfulness, you need to get some positive feedback that it's going to be successful and that there's going to be some difference in life, and clearly that's the intention, and that's what people begin to see, and that can be in many, many different ways, through their experience of stress, through their experience of behavioral management of ADHD, through communication. One thing we hardly touched on, or I hardly touched on talking so far, is is just ADHD is so laden with judgment in different ways, that sense that, either as your own self-judgment that you quote, should be able to do something different, or there might be a relative who seems to feel that way, or a major magazine or newspaper that implies that, if only life were different, your ADHD or his ADHD or her ADHD would go away. And one of the things that mindfulness really directly addresses that I think is unique is just directly looks at the influence and impact of that internalized judgment. We often call it the inner critic. And there's actually, research in psychology saying that when we're overly driven by that sense of self-judgment, it changes how we think, and it changes how we relate to others. So even though it's not talked about a whole lot directly, the capacity to build, to deal with that self-judgment, to be more compassionate for ourselves, really directly changes our experience of ADHD also. There's so much of a sense of should around ADHD, and it isn't always fair. It often isn't fair or appropriate. I think maybe I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, one person actually posted a question about that. He says, kind of want to use mindfulness to tackle the paralyzing guilt and shame that comes with living with ADHD, and I guess in his case he feels mountains of past failures.
Well, that's a really intense question, and I hope I hope some of what we're talking about can help with that. I never want to make overly big promises about anything in life, but at the same time, absolutely, a core message in mindfulness is that we can work with who we are, and that there's more going well in our lives than we're often acknowledging or focusing on, and that we all bring skills to the table. And the mindfulness practice itself, that awareness of judgment as being that voice of judgment, that kind of habitual. Now I often talk like I often give the example of, it's kind of like we're living with those two old guys from the old Muppet Show up in the balcony, who no matter what we're doing are kind of just like zinging off their one-liners and making us know that they think we're screwing up again. But it's not really a voice of logic. It's just a habit. It's just a way we've developed about thinking about our own experience. And I think when you bring mindfulness to ADHD care, it helps separate out that self-judgment from the practical steps we can make towards change. And that is absolutely part of what mindfulness practice does for many people. So, so I would hope it would help with that question, and bring some relief from that sense of, guilt and judgment.
Okay. So turning now to some of the specific questions, there's an interest in understanding a little more about how to use mindfulness in social situations specifically, and in relationships with husbands or children.
That's a great question, and I think there's two parts to that. One is that there's that bigger picture of what mindfulness is trying to build for us, which is feeling less stressed and reactive in everyday life, being more self-aware of what we're assuming, what we're doing, what we're thinking moment to moment, and just bringing more focused attention to situations, I think in and of itself changes how we relate to them. And that can be pretty subtle. There was somebody in a class I gave a few years ago who had this moment while she was taking the class where she was on her way up the stairs to yell at her teenage son again about the mess his room was, or I don't even know if she was going to yell, honestly, in retrospect. She was just to have the same discussion she was going to have. And then, 3/4 of the way up the stairs, she paused, and she did one of the practices that I introduced. And then she decided to go into the room with just sort of say, like, well, it's his room, and let's see what he has to say. And just that change in perspective led to, basically, she said, a couple of weeks of him not cleaning up his room at all. And then once she had stepped out of it and they'd stopped wrestling over it, he started taking his own steps towards improvement. So one thing is just like building mindfulness skills in and of ourselves. We can't make someone else be mindful, but we control our own actions, and we largely control our own actions and what we choose to say, and can work on that. The other side of it has to do with communication, which is directly impacted by ADHD in many, many ways that aren't talked about enough. ADHD symptoms impact communication. ADHD often goes along with communication differences and delays. And then for any of us, again, when we're feeling stressed and reactive, we're less likely to communicate skillfully. We're less likely to be able to pause and listen. We're less likely to think flexibly or to drop assumptions. So that when we begin practice mindfulness, again, it's not something that necessarily is going to turn on like a light switch, but it can turn on very quickly. I mean, just being aware that when we go into any situation involving communication, a discussion with our child, a discussion with our spouse, a discussion with a teacher, that if we pause and are more aware of how we're carrying our body and our tone of voice and the assumptions we're making about what they're going to say, and then coming back to just being fully present, not in a passive way. Maybe there are people whose communication habit might be to not be strong enough in communication, as much as I think the stereotype in talking about these things is we're not going to yell, but that's not it at all. Everyone reacts in different ways. So that when we focus on mindfulness as a set of traits we'd like to develop, I think we all have the opportunity to do that. We all are going to be different regardless of if we practice mindfulness. So it's not a matter of everyone fitting in the same box. It's just a matter of everyone putting a little more intention into what parts of themselves they'd like to build. And I think that can be done, again, both through the formal practice or just through consistently reminding yourself more informally that those are intentions and traits you'd like to work towards.
Okay. Interesting. A parent wants to know how mindfulness can help with the daily scheduling issues of an ADHD household: chores, homework, getting out the door at night, going to bed, in the morning, getting up, the whole, the daily
grind. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a perfect example of how mindfulness really can integrate into ADHD care overall, because you can look at it two ways. In terms of the practicing mindfulness yourself as a parent, what it often helps do is help you, keep both feet on the floor. It helps us stay grounded, because so much of sustaining the routines around ADHD as parents requires an awful lot of effort and tolerance for stress and resilience. And one of the things that often gets lost in discussing ADHD care is that's exhausting for parents. So that one piece of how mindfulness helps support daily routines is that somebody's working with you on ways to affect change and ways to problem solve and everything else, and yet the more you remember to take care of yourself and focus on how you're going to stay grounded in what you're planning on doing, the better the routine is going to go. So for example, if you're someone who's particularly triggered by the bedtime routine, there might be a routine you're trying to stick to, and then that moment you hear your child's foot on the bedroom floor, you get that visceral response of, oh, here we go again. And in that moment is so often where the structured routine falls apart. In that moment, we're swept up in reactivity and we give up on the routine. It's like, fine, just stay up later, or we yell, or we just get emotional ourselves, or whatever it is. And mindfulness often allows us to notice that happening sooner and then redirect ourselves so that we can stick to our plan. The other side of how mindfulness more integrates with ADHD care, though, is just recognizing that, of course, just sitting there being mindful isn't going to fix any of those routines. But approaching ADHD objectively, with awareness, and without as much reactivity allows us to problem solve differently, and allows us to, to sort of come back to, okay, how much of this is the routine we have created? What can we change? Where might there be some aspect of ADHD I'm completely not addressing, or is there something else going on for my child in the situation I'm not addressing? And more, more skill, or skill isn't quite the right word, because I don't want to be judgmental about it at all. It's just offering more tools for how do you manage the daily routines, because I think that's the other side of mindful ADHD together. One side of it is working towards changing how we come into those routines, And the other side of it is dropping assumptions and sort of, if a situation isn't working well, pausing and then going back to the book or going back to whoever you're working with to say, like, okay, why isn't the sleep routine working well? And what can we do differently? What habit, one example I often use about stress and bedtime is if you have two parents of a child who's 4.5 years old and just refuses to do bedtime well, and one of them has the assumption that a 4.5-year-old is going to require a ton of support and guidance to get them to bed on time, and one of them has the assumption that a 4.5-year-old should just go to bed without bothering their parents at all. I'm not saying who's right or wrong, but you can see very clearly that one of their experiences of the routine will be very stressful, and one of their experiences of the routine will be much less stressful just because of the perspective they're bringing to it. So some of the assumptions, there's so much written about and so much discussed about, again, that sense of judgment that goes along with ADHD, of you should be able to do this, or we've been doing this bedtime routine forever and it should be fixed by now, or you should just know how to keep yourself in bed. And changing that, noticing that as a habit, often allows us to change the routine itself, so that so to kind of pull that together. So on the one hand, we can work on whatever we're bringing to the routine so that we're able to be as resilient and responsive and flexible in problem solving as we possibly can. And the other side of it is trying to bring that same perspective of objectivity and seeing things as they are, and really trying to look at ADHD as a bunch of skills that we need to develop in ourselves or develop in children that allows for that next big step forward so the daily chaos improves.
It's interesting, as you were talking, two questions came in, one from a lawyer and one from a person in medical school. So two adults with ADHD. I'm going to read the questions, and both of the questions are filled with judgment about themselves. One person says, I'm a lawyer. Where does mindful fit in? When you're always a day late, a dollar short, late for everything, never adequately prepared, and especially troubled by large projects and deadlines. And then another person says, I have ADHD. I'm in my first year of medical school. I try to practice meditation and mindfulness, but I'm often still overwhelmed, and the social stigma related to ADHD and receiving accommodations is very difficult. Any suggestions on ways to utilize mindfulness more successfully in this environment? So here are two professionals, both grappling with the demands of their profession and feeling clearly inadequate, and wondering whether mindfulness can help.
Well, again, it's always, it is a consistent experience of ADHD to have that level of judgment as part of it. And I think, so, for really anyone living with ADHD, I would, again, step back and look at that bigger picture of two things. One is certainly, as I spoke about earlier, so I don't want to go into it again, the capacity to, one of the things that's amazing about having taught mindfulness for a while now is everybody, I can probably honestly say everybody really relates to that concept of the inner critic or self-judgment or the voice of judgment, we sometimes call it. And there definitely is an aspect of the practice which is just beginning to recognize that that isn't a logical voice. That isn't a voice that's sitting there with an adding machine doing some calculations and deciding, yeah, you're doing well, or yeah, you're not doing well. It's a habit we can label. And a psychologist friend of mine once described how in his psychological practice he doesn't practice mindfulness. He just encourages like labeling that habitual voice something as a way of being to distance from that some. Because once we're getting wrapped up in that voice like that, it often changes how we approach the rest of ADHD care. So, whether you're a lawyer, a physician, a teacher, a parent living with ADHD, when we're feeling that down on ourselves and overwhelmed, we're less likely to feel like we're capable of making changes. We're going to be quicker to dismiss changes that are possible or dismiss certain possibilities that are possible. So that absolutely, again, part of the practice of mindfulness is to work with that. And then, to me, the bigger picture of what it means to bring mindfulness and evidence-based ADHD care together is to recognize that part of the practice of mindfulness is periodically just pause and reassess, and pause and look at our assumptions, and pause and look at the choices we're making about things like, is there someone we can, work with who can help us structure things differently? Or if we're talking about habits, like I talked about before, like if I'm feeling overwhelmed by time management, is there a different way I have to approach it? Often I think there's, if you take on too much at once, plans fall apart. So is there a way to just do one small step towards change? Or do I need to find a new psychologist or ADHD coach? Or a really big one, because I think it's often sort of looked at as very separate from mindfulness, or look at something like the medication, where the decision-making about medication can be heavily influenced by our own judgment, by our own past experience, by how we're afraid someone else will judge it. And then, to bring mindfulness to decision-making means stepping back from the assumptions, going back to that basic question of, is it true? And maybe making a different decision about that. So that, mindfulness to me, will on one level help work with judgment in a way, but often is going to work best, integrated into this bigger perspective of how can I bring mindful awareness to, the coaching I'm doing, or how can I bring mindful awareness to seeking different accommodations, or asking for help about project management, or decisions about medication, or my sleep routine, or it's about that bigger capacity to adjust and be flexible. So I would hope it could be very, very helpful for all the different people who have brought up judgment and that just intensely overwhelming, awful feeling of self-judgment that is so common with ADHD. It absolutely can help with that piece of what's going on. But I would encourage you to then bring that perspective and the skills you're bringing and developing in your mindfulness practice back to the rest of the decision making around how can I do something different to also more practically address my ADHD.
Okay, so I think I understand what you're saying is, so for the example of a lawyer who, let's hypothesize that he is indeed always late for missed deadlines and so forth. You're saying that mindfulness can help him let go of the judgment and begin to take concrete steps to address how it can be more on time. Is that that's a simple way of saying it?
That's kind of the short of it. I mean, because even if you look at something, as straightforward, seemingly straightforward as being late, and one of the things that might happen is your judgmental self, judging yourself about being late. The other thing is that you might experience other people judging you about being late. But a third possibility that's often happens over the years is there's another judgment of like, this can never change. There's nothing that will ever be successful, and that's judgment too. You can say accurately that nothing I've done up until now has worked, but that doesn't mean nothing will work in the future. But as long as you're being, swept up in that voice of judgment, the problem, the problem solving is going to be affected by it.
Right.
And the steps you might take to change are going to be influenced by your experience that way too.
So just the very notion, I'm always late, I'm always behind, I have a stigma, I'm terrible, keeps you from making concrete steps to change the practical behaviors you're living with, is what I think what you're saying. That makes enormous sense. There's another comment here that's interesting. I think many people on the webinar will relate to this, from Karen. She says, mindfulness seems to require a great deal of self-control, to stop, to pause, to think, to observe, to analyze, and it seems impossible to me in dealing with my own ADD and my son's at the same time. Where do I get that self-control?
Right. It doesn't require self-control. I mean, it does require enough structure just to get started. There's no, so it does definitely require, using the app or partnering with someone or starting a class just to get your toe in the water. But mindfulness doesn't require self-control to begin, and there's no assumption you're going to be anybody but who you are. So that it can seem overwhelming, but the core concept is like, if you just catch yourself once and come back one time during either a mindfulness practice or during the day, that's great. That's one time you wouldn't have done it anyway otherwise. So again, to some degree, that's almost a sense of judgment again, of like, I can't do this, or this is for somebody else, when the core message, the core practices is all we could do is work with, wherever we are right now. And if that means life is chaotic because you're a parent with ADHD and your child has ADHD, no one's going to pay full attention to every moment of their day. You'd probably, you could drive yourself up the wall if you tried to, if that was the expectation you set. So really, if as with many people with ADHD, it feels like things are overwhelming and self-control is hard and you're distractible, that's normal. And honestly, everybody has that to some degree in life. It's just, amplified with ADHD. So that if you can just set the intention to try and just do that, just enough structure to, create some kind of reminder to yourself to do whatever you've set out to do, that brief practice once a day or whatever it's going to be, and then problem solve that too. I mean, you make the plan and even that might fall aside for a few days or a couple of weeks, and that's fine. Then you just come back and do it again. The thing about habits is, for better or worse, the habits we want to reproduce and the habits we don't, they reinforce themselves over time. They become hardwired, so that some of this around mindfulness parallels managing ADHD. It involves picking what you'd like to do, setting a reasonable, manageable intention for your next step, and then just creating the structure to reinforce that one small thing until it becomes more habitual. And then you build on that, and then you build on that. And that goes as much for managing ADHD as it does for beginning a mindfulness practice. And I think, whatever you're living with, ADHD or not, it's always possible to take those steps towards change.
Okay. Can you comment on a person whose husband has very severe ADHD? She is having a very difficult time with his inability, it sounds like more his inability to take concrete steps to get help. And she has a very poignant example of this very webinar where he said that mindfulness was going to be very helpful to him. He was interested in the webinar. She sent him an email about it. He forgot to sign up. She registered him. He said he put it in his calendar, but he didn't. And in any event, he is not listening today. And she's just wondering, how is she supposed to support her husband who has a really difficult time taking concrete steps forward?
That's another great question. And, as with all of these, I think it always, I think I'll stick to the sort of structure I've laid out so far today, which is, on the one hand, on a literal level, all any of us bring to any relationship directly is looking at how we're approaching the situation ourselves and how we're communicating and the steps we're taking, non-judgmentally. We're doing the best we can too. So, I mean, one piece of it is just that recognition, I think, that, we can keep the discussion going, we can try to create the structure in a more literal way, but at the same time, it isn't fully under our control when someone else has ADHD. But, I would couple that type of awareness, because I think the question being asked is really broader than a question about mindfulness by far, and really look at that broader concept of managing ADHD, which has to do with realistically creating systems that help, like Dr. Barkley's core concept of externalizing the system, recognizing that ADHD undermines organization, planning, routines, and all these other skills, and then trying to restructure things so that we can make, again, those steps that help address it more practically. Mm-hmm. So, and for your husband, it might be that there's a recording of this, so you try to set that up for a different day. And if it's a bigger family issue, again, it might be working with somebody from outside the sort of relationship dynamic who can help bring that structure to a relationship, as ADHD certainly causes similar stress in marriages as it does between parents and children that I described earlier.
Okay. That's interesting. Our time is almost up. There's some wonderful questions here. I wish we could answer all of them. Let me just ask a simple one that several people asked. Are there any specific apps that you found useful or recommend to people? Yeah, one of the cooler things about smartphones is as much as they can be a distraction, is that there are a growing number of ways we can use them more productively. So some of the mindfulness apps people talk about a lot are there is Get Some Headspace, or it's now called Headspace, is one. Stop, Breathe, and Think is another. And Calm.com
calm is another one, .com. The other thing you can do is if you go to mindful.org, which is the website for Mindful Magazine, they have a list of downloadable meditations, mindfulness practices. They have articles on apps and articles on how to get started and many other resources as well. So some of those are linked directly through my website too, but if you want to sort of explore beyond the few apps I just named, there are probably more than, there are plenty more than that I haven't been able to mention.
That's really terrific. Mindful.org magazine, great. People want that to have that repeated. Headspace, number 1, stop, breathe, and think, number 2, and calm.com, number 3. And also Dr. Bertin recommended going to mindful.org, a magazine that has lists of resources and lots of other good articles and ideas. So thank you so much, Dr. Bertin, and everyone for participating. I wish you all mindful addressing of all of our ADD symptoms. Website, Dr. Bertin's website again, developmentaldoctor.com. Please check in for our upcoming webinars here at Attitude on May 5th with the very remarkable Ross Green, how to help kids with behavior challenges at school. May 13, sensory challenges and fixes for children with ADHD. And Alan Brown on May 21st, 7 things that make your ADHD worse and how to fix them. And don't forget to log in to attitudemag.com/webinars to listen to past webinars. You can actually, experience them on demand, download audio, see slides from past webinars, lots of great resources there as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Bertin, and thank everyone for being here today.
All right, thank you for having me. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.